The morning sky above Ouagadougou lay thick with the threat of devastation. Dark clouds moved across the horizon like a marching army. Their shadows cast a grim pall over Burkina Faso's capital city. Weather stations had issued alerts for 3 days, yet no one expected the wrath soon to be unleashed on the unaware population. Ibrahim Traoré stood at the presidential palace window, his worn hands clasped behind him as he watched the first raindrops hit the glass. At 34, he had already seen more unrest than most leaders face in a lifetime. The military officer turned president had taken control in a bloodless coup 2 years prior, pledging to restore honor to his war-torn country. Now, as nature prepared to challenge his leadership in ways he hadn't imagined, the burden of responsibility settled on him like a heavy cloak. Mr. President, his aide, Lieutenant Colonel Sankara, approached with urgency etched on his face. The meteorological department reports this storm is unlike anything in decades. Rainfall could reach unprecedented levels within hours. Traoré turned from the window, his sharp eyes reflecting the seriousness. What are our emergency protocols? Are evacuation centers ready? All emergency services have been activated, sir. Red Cross volunteers are positioning in high-risk zones and military units are on standby. However, infrastructure in older districts. Sankara's voice trailed off, the unspoken truth hanging between them. The president nodded grimly. Burkina Faso's drainage systems, weakened by years of neglect and lack of funding, were about to face their ultimate test. The narrow streets in historic neighborhoods where generations had lived would turn deadly as waters rose. Outside, rain grew intense with unnatural speed. What began as light drops became sheets of water falling with malevolent force. The pounding on palace windows grew from a whisper to a roar, drowning the city's usual hum. Street vendors rushed to protect their goods. Children ran for shelter, and the few lucky enough to own vehicles were trapped in swiftly forming rivers where roads had been. In the Tempoui district, where narrow alleys wound past modest concrete homes, 62-year-old Aminata Sawadogo sat in her wheelchair, watching water creep toward her front door. Born with spina bifida, she'd spent her life navigating a world not built for her needs. Her small house, inherited from her parents, was in one of the neighborhood's lowest spots, a fact she'd never worried about in dry seasons but now filled her with fear. An hour earlier, her neighbor Mamadou had pounded on her door, shouting over the storm's roar, "Aminata, you must leave now! The water's coming fast!" But leaving wasn't simple for someone whose legs never carried her weight. Her wheelchair, made for indoors, was useless in rising floodwaters. The narrow doorway, uneven ground outside, and lack of accessible transport all trapped her as surely as chains. "I cannot," she called back through the door. "Where would I go? How would I get there?" Mamadou's silence said it all. In a nation with virtually no disability services, Aminata's plight was sadly common but desperate. Eventually, she heard footsteps splashing away as Mamadou fled to higher ground with family. Now alone, Aminata watched murky water seep under her door like a living thing, spreading relentlessly across her floor. The electricity had failed 20 minutes ago, plunging her into twilight, where the only sounds were rain drumming on the metal roof and the gurgle of water invading every corner. She moved her wheelchair as far from the flood as she could, but her small home offered little refuge. The water kept advancing, and she knew that within hours, perhaps minutes, her house would become her tomb. Her hands trembled as she reached for her old radio, hoping the battery would last long enough to hear another voice. Static crackled, then cleared briefly to reveal a panicked news broadcaster, "Emergency services overwhelmed. Citizens urged to evacuate immediately." Unprecedented flooding throughout the capital. As if summoned by the warning, a new sound broke through the storm's roar, the distant wail of sirens growing closer. But Aminata knew emergency vehicles wouldn't reach her narrow street, now a torrent. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, not for rescue but for strength to face what came next. Meanwhile, at the presidential palace, reports flooded in as fast as waters rose through city streets. President Traoré had turned the Situation Room into a command center, maps spread everywhere, radios crackling with desperate updates from across the capital. "Mr. President," an emergency coordinator burst in, soaked from moving between buildings. "We have reports of people trapped in homes citywide. Water is rising faster than predicted. We must deploy every resource immediately." Traoré leaned over a detailed map of Ouagadougou, tracing the most at-risk areas. What about military helicopters? Can we use them for evacuations? Weather too severe for safe flights, sir. We're limited to ground and boat rescues, which are becoming increasingly dangerous as currents strengthen. The president felt the familiar weight of command settle on him. His decisions in coming hours would determine who lived and who died. It was a burden he'd carried since taking office, but never with such immediate consequences. "I want every boat in the water," he ordered. "Every soldier, every volunteer, every piece of equipment. We will not lose our people to this storm." As he spoke, none could imagine that within hours he'd risk his life, in the very waters now threatening to engulf his capital. The storm showed no mercy as it entered its second furious hour. What started as heavy rain became a deluge challenging the very foundations of civilization. The streets of Ouagadougou vanished beneath furious torrents that swept away everything in their path. Bicycles, furniture, dreams, and hope itself. President Traoré's command center buzzed with focused urgency. Military personnel coordinated with civilian emergency services while radio operators kept contact with rescue teams spread across the city. Situation reports painted an increasingly grim picture. "Sir, we've lost contact with the team in Sector 7, reported the communications officer, his voice tense. Their last message said they were trying to reach stranded civilians in the Tampoui district." Traoré studied the map, his finger finding the spot. Tampoui was one of the capital's oldest neighborhoods. Its narrow streets and low-lying terrain made it especially vulnerable to flooding. Worse, many residents were elderly or disabled, groups facing extra challenges during evacuations. "What resources do we have there?" he asked. Lieutenant Kunal Sankara checked his clipboard. 2 rescue boats were sent 40 minutes ago, but the water had risen so fast they struggled to navigate the streets. The current was too strong for safe operation. Outside the palace windows, Traoré saw the transformed cityscape. Once busy roads now flowed as brown rivers rushing toward the central districts with unnatural speed. The sound was deafening, not just rain, but the roar of water pushing air aside, debris crashing against buildings, and distant cries for help. In Tampoui, Aminata Ouagadougou faced her darkest moment. Water rose to her knees as she sat in her wheelchair, the current tugging harder at her feet. Her small home, a refuge for decades, was quickly becoming a trap. Furniture floated around her like pieces of a shattered life, family photos slowly disappearing beneath the rising flood. She had called her neighbor's number on her cell before water claimed it, but the call went to voicemail. Everyone able to flee had done so, leaving behind the elderly, the disabled, the forgotten who lived in a world built for others. Her radio, her last link to the outside, crackled with desperate updates. Emergency services report several districts now unreachable by normal means. Death toll expected to rise sharply. Citizens urged to move to highest ground. Aminata looked around her one-room house. The highest ground was her bed, but even it was partly underwater. With great effort, she shifted from her wheelchair to the metal bed frame, pulling herself up as water pressed on relentlessly. Her hands gripped a wooden crucifix that belonged to her mother. At 62, she'd lived through droughts, political turmoil, and the daily struggles of disability in a society offering little help. But this felt different, final somehow. Voices outside her window made her heart leap. Through rain-streaked glass, she saw figures moving through floodwaters, distorted but clearly human. She tried to call out, but her voice was lost in the storm's roar. "Help!" she screamed, using every ounce of strength. "Please, I'm trapped inside." The figures paused. One pointed at her window. They wore military uniforms and carried ropes and flotation devices. Hope stirred in her chest for the first time in hours. Back at the presidential palace, the crisis deepened. Reports came in of entire neighborhoods cut off from rescue, with death tolls climbing hourly. The storm showed no sign of easing. Forecasters warned the worst was still ahead. "Mr. President," an aide rushed in, soaked from moving between buildings. "We have a priority message from the Tampoui team. They've found several stranded civilians, but need immediate backup. Conditions are worsening fast." Traoré felt the protective instinct that had driven him through his military career. These were his people, citizens he'd vowed to protect. The thought of them drowning while he stayed safe in his palace was unbearable. "What backup do they need?" he asked. "More boats, sir, and stronger swimmers. The current is too fierce for standard rescues. They need people trained for extreme conditions." The president glanced at his staff. focused and dedicated professionals doing all they could. But coordination wasn't enough anymore. Direct action was required. "Sankara," he called, "prepare my gear. I'm going out there." The room fell silent except for radio crackles. Everyone knew the meaning of their president's words: unprecedented, risky, and potentially catastrophic for the young government's stability. "Mr. President," Sankara said with respect, "your place is here coordinating. If something happens to you, if something happens to me, I'll have died trying to save my people." Traoré answered firmly, "How can I ask others to risk their lives if I won't risk mine?" Ibrahim Traoré had never felt comfortable with power's trappings. The palace, the protocol, the distance from the people he served. It all felt false to him. He was a soldier at heart, someone who led from the front lines, not from behind a desk. "But sir," another aide interrupted, "the security protocols. These protocols didn't account for a situation like this." Traoré cut him off firmly. "Sometimes leadership means stepping beyond protocols to do what's right." He strode toward the door, his mind already locked on the mission ahead. Behind him, his staff exchanged uneasy glances, but they knew their president well enough to understand his decision was final. "Sarah, you're coming with me?" he ordered. "Get the emergency response team to prepare a boat and meet us at the north gate, and set up a direct line to the rescue team in Tampawey. I want to know exactly what we're facing." As the president readied to leave the safety of his palace, Aminata Sawadogo clung to her bed frame, watching the water rise toward her chest. The voices outside had faded, and she feared the rescue team had moved on to easier targets. The bitter irony wasn't lost on her. She had survived 6 decades of hardship only to face death in the home she loved. The storm raged on, indifferent to human suffering, as if testing the very fabric of society itself. In less than an hour, the paths of a president and a disabled woman would cross in a moment that would define not just their individual fates, but the character of an entire nation. The presidential convoy was modest: a single military truck and 2 boats mounted on trailers. It reflected urgency, not pomp. President Traoré sat in the passenger seat of the lead truck, his military fatigue soaked through despite the short journey from the palace to the deployment point. Lieutenant Colonel Sankara had tried 3 times to persuade him otherwise, but each attempt met Traoré's unyielding resolve. The man who had led a bloodless coup promising to restore dignity to Burkina Faso was not about to abandon his principles when his people needed him most. Radio contact with Team Alpha. The communications officer reported through static. "They've located the civilian in Tampawey, but the situation is critical. Water is rising faster than expected, and the building's structural integrity is compromised." Traoré pressed the radio button. "Team Alpha, this is Command. What's your exact position and status?" "Command, we're at the intersection of Rukabor and Avenue Sankura. The civilian is trapped in a single-story structure about 50 meters south of our position. Female, elderly, wheelchair-bound. The building is partially submerged. We estimate less than 30 minutes before water reaches a critical level." Traoré exchanged a grim look with Sankara. 30 minutes was optimistic given how fast the flood was advancing. They likely had about 20 minutes to reach the site, evaluate, and execute a rescue under conditions that would test even the most experienced responders. "Team Alpha, hold your position. Additional resources are on the way. Do not attempt the rescue until we arrive." "Understood, Command," came the crackled reply. "But sir, if conditions worsen, we may not have a choice." Traoré understood the meaning beneath those words. The rescue team was ready to risk their lives rather than watch a helpless woman drown, even if it meant defying orders. It was the kind of courage and dedication that made him proud to serve alongside them. The truck stopped at the flood's edge where Ouagadougou's familiar streets gave way to a landscape resembling a war zone. The boats were quickly unloaded and launched into what had once been a bustling commercial district. Now, shop signs and street lamps jutted from the water like tombstones marking the death of normal life. "Mr. President," the boat operator called over the engine's roar, "the current is stronger than we expected. We'll need to take a longer, safer route to reach the target area." Traoré nodded, but kept his gaze fixed on the distant neighborhood where Aminata fought for her life. Every delay could mean the difference between survival and death for her and countless others trapped by the flood. As their boat weaved through submerged cars and floating debris, the president's radio crackled with updates from across the city. The disaster's full scope was becoming clear. This was more than a flood. It was a catastrophe that would reshape Ouagadougou and test its people's resilience. Sankara, we're approaching Tampui. Team Alpha should be ahead. The president shouted over the engine noise. Through the driving rain, Traoré made out the shapes of the rescue team near a cluster of partially submerged buildings. Their boat was anchored against the current. Several team members were testing water depth and strength. "Command, this is Team Alpha," came the crackling voice. "We see movement in the target building, but water has risen since last report. We estimate the civilian has about 15 minutes before conditions become untenable." Traoré's boat pulled alongside the rescue team's vessel, and the challenges became clear. Aminata's building sat in a rushing river of water, its roof barely visible. The current was so strong even the best swimmers would struggle to hold their ground. "What's the tactical assessment?" Traoré asked the team leader, Sergeant Wedrao, a veteran of elite military units. "Sir, the structure is unstable. Water pressure is compromising the walls, and debris is striking the building. Any rescue will be extremely dangerous for both the civilian and the rescuers." Traoré took in the scene, his military instincts rapidly weighing risks and options. The usual approach would be to wait for waters to recede or for more resources, but Aminata didn't have that kind of time. "What about using ropes to create a lifeline?" he suggested. "We've considered that, sir, but all the anchoring points are compromised by the flood," came the reply. "The trees are too young, and the buildings are structurally unsound." Inside her trapped home, Aminata had climbed onto her table, which now floated like a makeshift raft. The water had risen to within inches of the ceiling, and the building groaned under the pressure. Her earlier prayers had given way to a strange calm, as if she had made peace with whatever fate awaited her. Then she heard it. Voices close enough to be real, not imagined. Through the window, she saw boats and figures in the water, one pointing straight at her building. "Help!" she called out, her voice echoing over the water. "I'm here. Please help me." The rescue team stirred into action. One figure, taller than the rest and wearing a different insignia, began removing his jacket and checking his gear. "Mr. President," Sergeant Wedrao said urgently, "you can't be serious." "I'm not considering it," Traoré replied firmly. "I'm doing it." Before anyone could stop him, the president secured a rope around his waist and prepared to enter the water. His military training had included extensive water survival skills, and he was arguably the strongest swimmer among them. "Sir, this isn't about courage," Sankara pleaded. "It's about calculated risk. If we lose you, we lose our leader in the middle of a national crisis." Traoré paused, hands gripping the rope. He understood the logic, but he also knew something deeper. Leadership sometimes demanded personal sacrifice, and the bond between a leader and his people was forged in moments of shared danger. "Sankara, if I don't come back, you know what needs to happen. The Constitution provides for succession, and our government is strong enough to survive this crisis. But if I don't try to save this woman, I'll never be able to face myself again." With that, he slipped into the churning water, the rope feeding out behind him as he battled the current toward the submerged building. The water was shockingly cold and littered with debris that struck him like projectiles. Within seconds, he understood why the rescue team hesitated. The conditions were far worse than they appeared from the relative safety of the boat. But somewhere inside that building, Aminata Ouagadougou was running out of time, and Ibrahim Traoré was determined she wouldn't die alone. The water fought him with the fury of a living thing. Every stroke earned him precious inches toward the building where Aminata clung to life. The current threatened to sweep him away, while floating debris turned the rescue into a deadly obstacle course. Behind him, the rescue team carefully played out the rope. Their voices were lost in the storm's roar, but their presence was felt in the lifeline connecting the president to safety. Sergeant Wedrao stood at the rope's anchor, his weathered hands keeping tension as his eyes tracked every move of their commander-in-chief. "Distance remaining 30 meters. He called out, though he knew Traoré couldn't hear over the chaos. The president's military training had prepared him for many scenarios, but nothing like this. Swimming in full gear against a flood current, trying to maintain orientation, demanded every ounce of his physical and mental strength. His arms burned, his lungs gasped for oxygen. As he neared the building, the structural damage became painfully clear. The flood had undermined the foundation. Walls bowed outward under pressure. Worse, the roof sat barely 18 inches above the water level. Aminata had almost no breathing room left. "Hello," he shouted as he reached the building's wall. "Can you hear me?" From inside came a faint voicey, "Yes, yes, I'm here. Please help me." The sound of another human voice amid the disaster renewed Traoré's determination. He circled the building, searching for the safest entry point. The front door was submerged, but a window on the side showed a few inches of glass above the waterline. "I'm coming through the window," he called. "Move away from the wall if you can." Using a rescue knife from his gear, he carefully broke the glass and cleared the frame. The opening was small, barely wide enough to squeeze through, but it was their only chance. Inside, Aminata heard his voice and felt a surge of hope she thought lost forever. She balanced precariously on her floating table, gripping the edges as the current swirled around her. "I'm disabled," she called out. "I can't swim or walk. I'm on a table in the center of the room." Traoré absorbed this, squeezing through the window frame. Inside was a surreal underwater landscape, floating furniture like islands, belongings drifting like fragments of a broken life. The murky water limited visibility to just a few feet. "Keep talking," he urged. "I need to find you by your voice." "I'm straight ahead from the window," she said. "My name is Aminata Sowadogo. I've lived here for 37 years. Following her voice, Traoré navigated past floating debris until he saw her, a slight woman in her 60s, perched on the wooden table. Her eyes were wide with fear but held a quiet dignity born of a lifetime of resilience. "Aminata," he said, swimming closer. "I'm Ibrahim. I'm here to get you out." She looked at him, puzzled by his military fatigues and gear. "Are you with the army?" "Something like that," he replied, not wanting to complicate things with his true identity. "We need to move fast. The water is rising, and this building won't hold much longer." The rescue was going to be full of challenges, each moment critical. Aminata couldn't support herself in the water. The window opening was narrow, and the current inside the building grew stronger as more water poured in. Traoré had to quickly devise a plan to get them both to safety without putting either at greater risk. "Aminata, I need you to trust me completely," he said, positioning himself beside her floating table. "I'm going to secure you to me with this rope, and then we'll go through that window together. You don't need to do anything except hold on and let me do the work." Her hands trembled, but she nodded. "I trust you." Though working swiftly, Traoré fashioned a makeshift harness, ensuring Aminata was securely fastened to his body for the swim ahead. The rope was tight enough to prevent slipping but loose enough to avoid restricting her breathing or causing harm. "Are you ready?" he asked. "Ready," she replied, her voice shaky with fear. The moment they entered the water together, Traoré felt the full weight of responsibility. He was no longer fighting for his own life alone. He carried the life of another, someone who depended entirely on his strength and skill. The swim to the window was the longest 20 feet of his life. Aminata's body added drag, and her fear made her grip him tighter than necessary, limiting his movement. But he pressed on, battling the current and the growing fatigue burning in his muscles. Getting through the window required perfect timing and precision. Traoré had to position Aminata ahead of him, push her through the narrow opening, and follow immediately before the current could pull them apart. Jagged shards of broken glass threatened to cut them, both as they squeezed through. "Almost there," he gasped as they cleared the window and emerged into open water. From the boat, the rescue team watched with mounting anxiety. When two figures surfaced, a cheer erupted, cutting through the storm's roar. "Rope recovery," Sergeant Ouedraogo shouted. "Bring them in." The journey back to the boat was easier with the current now working in their favor, but Traoré was utterly exhausted. His arms felt like lead, and his lungs burned with each breath. Only his determination to get Aminata safely to the rescue team kept him moving. Strong hands pulled them from the water, and Aminata was wrapped in warm blankets on the boat's deck. For the first time in hours she felt safe, but also confused about her rescuer's identity. "Who are you?" she asked the man who had risked everything for her. Lieutenant Colonel Sankara glanced at the president, recovering nearby. Then back to Aminata, who had no idea that the president of Burkina Faso had personally pulled her from the flood. "I'm Ibrahim Traoré," the president said quietly. "I believe every life has value, and no one should ever die alone." As their boat made its way to safety, word of the rescue spread rapidly through emergency channels. The story seemed almost too incredible to believe. The president personally entering floodwaters to save a disabled woman he'd never met. By the time they reached the evacuation center, news crews had gathered. The image of an exhausted, soaked President Traoré helping Aminata from the rescue boat became one of the defining photographs of his presidency. "Mr. President," a reporter called out, "what made you risk your life for one civilian?" Traoré looked at the reporter, then at Aminata, being tended by medical staff. "In this country, we don't leave people behind. We don't abandon our most vulnerable when they need us most. Today, we prove that our values aren't just words, they are actions." The storm would rage for hours longer, and the recovery would take months. But the rescue of Aminata Sawadogo by Ibrahim Traoré had already achieved something no political speech could. A powerful testament that true leadership is measured not by comfort or power, but by the willingness to sacrifice for others. As the story spread beyond Burkina Faso, it became a symbol of hope in a world too often ruled by cynicism and self-interest. The image of a president risking his life to save a disabled woman resonated across Africa and beyond. For Aminata, the rescue marked a new beginning. The government provided accessible housing and support services that enabled her to live independently. More importantly, her story became a catalyst for improving emergency preparedness for disabled citizens nationwide. For Ibrahim Traoré, the rescue reaffirmed his belief that leadership is about service, not privilege. In the years ahead, he would continue leading from the front, always remembering the lesson learned in the floodwaters of Ouagadougou. A leader's true measure is how they respond when their people need them most. The storm had tested not only Burkina Faso's physical infrastructure, but also the moral fiber of its leadership. In that test, both the president and his nation proved they were built to endure.